Back in the early 2000s, Honda made a genius engine that in theory shouldn't have existed. Let me explain. At the time, all of the current MotoGP teams were either building 4-stroke V4 engines or inline-4 engines. A V4 engine is an engine with 2 cylinders on each side arranged in a V shape, and an inline-4 is simply 4 pistons all lined up in a row. However, Honda decided this wasn't good enough and instead built an all-new 4-stroke V5 engine, which had 2 cylinders on one side but 3 cylinders on the other. This seemed like absolute madness, especially when every other team were running V4s or inline-4s. Why go in a different direction entirely? Well, before we go into all of that, I want to go through the history of how Honda even came up with the idea of a V5. From the late 70s to 2001, teams in the Premier class were allowed to use 2-stroke or 4-stroke engines up to 500cc, although everyone at the time used 2 strokes because they produced more power and they were lighter. Now, while Honda was a large part of Premier class racing, there is a slight gap in their history, and it was due to regulation changes to make everything cheaper. These regulation changes stopped manufacturers from effectively building whatever bike they wanted, and instead restricted them to build bikes with engines up to 4 cylinders and with only 6 gears. And these changes actually angered Honda so much that they left for around a decade. However, when they came back into the sport, they were unstoppable. Even though Honda never liked the idea of 2-stroke machines, they eventually gave in and won a staggering 11 championships from 1979 to 2001. They even managed 6 back-to-back victories from 1994 to 1999. One of these championships was won by the NS 500 and the rest was won on the NSR 500. But after 30 years of 2-stroke engines being used in the Premier class of bike racing, the FIM wanted to start moving away from them. And in 2002, they went through another massive rule change. Teams could still run 2-stroke engines, but they could only be up to 500cc's. But they were able to run 4-stroke engines up to 990cc's. And they could also choose their engine configuration. Remember that bit, it's important in a second. With all of these new regulations in place, pretty much every team opted for 4-stroke V4 engines or inline-4 engines. They were reliable and they were proven to win, but Honda decided otherwise, and this became the start of their V5 project. But what was so appealing about a V5 engine? It was inherently wrong. It shouldn't be possible to make a V5 engine, let alone make it competitive for MotoGP. So let's take a closer look. A big part of why a V5 was worse than a V4, on paper at least, was the balance of the engine. Balance is incredibly important when building an engine. A V4 is naturally well balanced because it's symmetrical. It's got 4 pistons, 2 pistons on each side, 90 degrees apart from each other in a V shape. And both sets of pistons also share the same crank pin, which when paired with some cleverly designed counterweights, means a V4 engine is able to achieve perfect primary balance. So with this in mind, if we take a normal V4 and add an extra cylinder to one side of it, all of a sudden we now have an engine that's unbalanced. It's not symmetrical, and it's basically going to shake itself to pieces, which isn't ideal. This is where Honda's genius design comes into play. To create the V5, Honda took an unbalanced V4 and then used their extra piston to balance it back out. But how did they unbalance a V4 in the first place? Well, they did this by adjusting the angle of the pistons either side from 90 degrees to 75.5 degrees. This in itself provided a huge benefit, but I'm going to touch on that a little bit later in this video. But why 75.5 degrees specifically? Well, a piston doesn't actually reach its highest speed halfway through its stroke, which is normally 90 degrees. It's actually just before, and it's to do with the connecting rod. A connecting rod moves up and down, but it also rotates, and this rotation effectively shortens the distance between the piston and the crankshaft. This accelerates the piston a tiny bit so that it can make up for that extra distance, which is why the maximum speed of the piston is at 75.5 degrees or around that figure. I won't dive too much into this, but Driving for Answers has an incredible in-depth explanation on this. If you want to see that, I'll link it in the description below. So, at 75.5 degrees of crankshaft rotation, the piston is moving at its fastest, reducing the force that it applies to the engine, which is crucial for keeping the engine balanced. The layout means there's 2 main crank pins for 4 pistons, which are called the common crank pins. But there's a third odd crank pin for the unique unpaired piston, and the distance between these crank pins is 104.5 degrees. That's going to be important in a second, so keep that in mind. Now remember, the Honda V5 doesn't have a bank angle of 90 degrees, it's 75.5 degrees. So when Bank 2's outer pistons are at their highest point, they're pushing upwards, but the pistons on the other side of the engine are travelling at their maximum speed with minimal force. This helps in counteracting the vibrations and forces inside of the engine. And when you take into account the odd piston with the offset crank pin at 104.5 degrees and some clever counterweight adjustments, Honda's engineers managed to achieve perfect primary balance for their V5. But all of this work still doesn't explain the benefits of making a V5 in the first place. Well, that's exactly what I'm going to explain for you now. A massive advantage of the V5 is it was actually smaller than a V4. Because the engine had more pistons than a V4, they were smaller and could be placed closer together, making the engine smaller overall. And a smaller engine means it can fit in the bike better, improving the handling. And because they reduced the bank angle, they were able to make the engine shorter, which allowed an overall smaller package. This makes the bike more responsive, which all aids in making the bike faster across a lap. But it wasn't just the handling. With the dominance of two-strokes in the past, Honda wanted to try and maximise the power of their new generation of bikes. Remember what I said earlier on about two-stroke engines being able to produce more power? Well, it's largely due to the higher number of power pulses they're able to make. Stay with me. A two-stroke engine creates a power pulse every crank revolution. That's the full motion up and back down for the piston. A four-stroke, on the other hand, which is what teams went to in the early 2000s, creates a power pulse every 2 crank revolutions, which ultimately means less power. So if that's the case, why did teams move from 2 strokes to 4 strokes, if it actually left this power advantage on the table? Well, it's because 2-stroke engines were limited to 500cc and 4-stroke engines could be up to 990cc. If the engines were the same size, it was a no-brainer, but with the reduced size of 2 strokes, it made running them pretty pointless. Now, with that being said, teams would have missed the additional power pulses that they provided. So by adding another piston, you do get another power pulse, helping minimise the loss. So how dominant was the V5 and the bike that used it, which was the RC211V? Well, very. Valentino Rossi claimed back-to-back victories in 2002 and 2003, and Nicky Hayden took another championship in 2006. Not only that, but in its 5 years of racing, the V5-powered RC211V won a staggering 58% of all the races it entered, taking 48 wins out of a possible 82. And to top it all off, the RC211V took 4 Constructors' Championships, cementing it to be one of the most successful bikes ever created. So there we go. If you want to see more of these videos, then make sure you hit that subscribe button. And if you want to see me make a video on anything in the future, let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, take care, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one.